Have you ever noticed how some people seem incredibly independent, a little skeptical of authority, quietly resilient, and oddly comfortable being on their own? They're not loud about their struggles, they rarely ask for help, and yet they somehow manage to adapt to almost anything life throws at them. If that sounds familiar, you might be looking at the psychology of Generation X. Generation X, typically born between the mid-1960s and early 1980s, grew up in a world that was rapidly changing. They witnessed the rise of technology, the shift from analog to digital life, economic uncertainty, cultural revolutions, and the early days of the internet. But more importantly, they grew up during a time when independence wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. So what shaped the mindset of Gen X? Why do they often appear so self-reliant, skeptical, adaptable, and emotionally guarded? And could these traits actually be psychological strengths rather than flaws? In this video, we'll explore the psychology of Generation X and uncover 6 powerful traits that define this generation: their fierce independence, their natural skepticism, their resilience, their adaptability, their quiet emotional intelligence, and their surprising ability to thrive in solitude. And by the end of this video, you might realize that what looks like emotional distance or quiet independence might actually be one of the most powerful psychological skill sets any generation has developed. Let's dive in. Ever wondered why Gen X seems so comfortable doing things alone? One major reason is the environment they grew up in. Many Gen X kids were known as latchkey kids. Their parents often worked long hours, and it wasn't unusual for them to come home from school to an empty house, make their own snacks, finish homework on their own, and figure things out without constant supervision. From a psychological perspective, this kind of upbringing builds something called self-efficacy, the belief that you can handle problems on your own. When a child repeatedly solves challenges independently, their brain begins wiring itself to trust their own abilities. This is why many Gen X adults rarely panic when things go wrong. Their mindset tends to be, "I'll figure it out." And while some people see this independence as emotional distance, it can actually be a superpower. People who develop strong self-efficacy are often more confident decision-makers and less dependent on external validation. In other words, Gen X didn't just learn independence, their brains were trained for it. Have you ever noticed how Gen X tends to question everything? They don't blindly trust institutions, trends, or authority figures. Instead, they often pause, analyze, and ask, is this actually true? Psychologically, this trait developed during a time when many traditional systems were being challenged. Gen X witnessed political scandals, corporate downsizing, cultural shifts, and the early days of media skepticism. Because of this environment, many of them developed what psychologists call critical thinking resilience, the ability to question narratives instead of automatically accepting them. While some people interpret this skepticism as cynicism, there's another way to look at it. Skeptical minds tend to be better at detecting manipulation, misinformation, and unrealistic promises. In today's world, where information spreads instantly, that ability might actually be one of the most valuable cognitive defenses you can have. So when Gen X questions things, it's not negativity, it's psychological self-protection. Here's something you might not realize. Gen X grew up during constant change. They witnessed economic recessions, the transition from traditional jobs to unstable career markets, the rise of computers, and the early disruption of entire industries. Living through that kind of uncertainty builds a psychological trait known as adaptive resilience. Adaptive resilience means your brain becomes comfortable with instability. Instead of expecting life to remain predictable, you develop the ability to adjust quickly when things shift. That's why many Gen X adults are surprisingly calm during crises. Their mental model of the world already includes the possibility that things might suddenly change. And here's the interesting part. Research in psychology shows that people who experience moderate challenges early in life often develop stronger emotional coping mechanisms later. So what looks like toughness in Gen X isn't accidental. It's the result of decades of navigating uncertainty. Have you thought about how unique Gen X's technological experience really is? They are the only generation that fully remembers life before the internet and also had to adapt to a completely digital world. They grew up with cassette tapes, landline phones, and handwritten letters. Then, suddenly, they had to learn email, smartphones, social media, and artificial intelligence. Psychologically, this created a fascinating cognitive advantage: mental flexibility. Mental flexibility is the brain's ability to adjust to new systems, new tools, and new environments. When someone repeatedly learns completely different ways of doing things, their brain becomes more adaptable overall. This is why many Gen X adults can comfortably navigate both analog and digital environments. They understand traditional systems, but they've also learned to adapt to modern technology. And in a world where change happens faster every year, adaptability might be the ultimate survival skill. At first glance, Gen X can appear emotionally reserved. They might not openly discuss their feelings the way younger generations often do, but that doesn't mean they lack emotional awareness. In many cases, the opposite is true. Gen X tends to display what psychologists call observational emotional intelligence. Instead of expressing emotions loudly, they often read the room, observe behavior patterns, and quietly process what others are feeling. Because they grew up in an era where emotional independence was common, many learned to analyze emotions internally rather than publicly. And this can lead to strong empathy, even if it's expressed in subtle ways. For example, a Gen X friend might not say, "I understand exactly how you feel," but they might quietly show up when you need support. Sometimes emotional intelligence isn't about talking more. Sometimes it's about understanding more. Finally, one of the most fascinating psychological traits of Gen X is their comfort with solitude. Many people today struggle with being alone. Silence feels uncomfortable, and constant digital connection becomes the default. But Gen X grew up spending long hours entertaining themselves, reading, listening to music, exploring outside, or simply thinking. From a psychological standpoint, solitude strengthens self-reflection. When your brain regularly experiences quiet time, it becomes better at processing thoughts, regulating emotions, and generating creative ideas. Research shows that people who are comfortable with solitude often develop stronger emotional stability. So while solitude sometimes gets misunderstood as isolation, it can actually be a mental training ground for deeper thinking. And Gen X has had decades of practice. So what is the real psychology of Generation X? It's independence shaped by experience, skepticism shaped by observation, resilience built through uncertainty, adaptability created by technological change, quiet emotional intelligence developed through reflection, and a deep comfort with solitude. These traits might not always be loud or obvious, but together they form a powerful psychological toolkit for navigating a complex world. In many ways, Gen X became the bridge generation, connecting the analog past with the digital future, while quietly developing the resilience needed to survive both. And if you're part of Gen X, you might recognize some of these traits in yourself: that quiet independence, that ability to adapt, that instinct to question things before accepting them. Those aren't weaknesses, they're psychological strengths. Now I'm curious, do these traits sound like you or someone you know? Comment below and share your experience with the Gen X mindset. And if you enjoyed exploring the psychology behind generational traits, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more insights into human behavior and the hidden patterns that shape the way we think, feel, and live.